Eleanor Whitmore buried her father on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she was alone at the kitchen table with a lantern, 3 years of account books, and a letter from Nathaniel Carter, the most powerful man in Virginia, informing her that everything her family owned now belonged to him. She didn't cry. She opened the books to the first page and started reading. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And, if you haven't subscribed yet, stay with Eleanor until the very end. She's going to need a witness. The morning Nathaniel Carter rode up the drive of Whitmore Farm, the summer heat was already unbearable. Dust rose in pale columns from the road. The horses pulling his black carriage moved at a steady, unhurried pace the way powerful men move when they already know the outcome. Eleanor heard the wheels before she saw them. She was in the barn, checking the ledger she kept tucked between 2 loose boards in the wall, a habit she'd started 3 years ago when she first noticed the numbers her father showed. The bank didn't match the numbers she was seeing with her own eyes. She heard the carriage, and she did not run. She set the ledger back in its place, smoothed her dress, and walked out to meet whatever was coming. There were 2 men on the bench of the carriage. The driver, a square-shouldered man who didn't make eye contact, and beside him, riding separately on a dark horse, was a man Eleanor had only ever seen from a distance at county meetings. Tall in the saddle, dark coat despite the heat, eyes that moved over the property the way a man's eyes move over something he is already calculating the worth of. Nathaniel Carter. She had heard the stories, same as everyone in Albemarle County. That he never raised his voice. That he never needed to. That when he made an offer on a piece of land, the answer was always yes. Not because he forced it, but because refusing Nathaniel Carter in Virginia in 1817 was like refusing the tide. It simply didn't work out well for the person who tried. He swung down from the horse with the ease of a man who'd been riding since before he could read. He looked at her, just looked for a long moment, and then he removed his hat. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Carter. She didn't step back. She had promised herself she would not step back. I expected you'd send someone. I handle matters of significance personally. He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. I believe you know why I'm here. She took the envelope without opening it. She already knew what was in it. She'd known for 6 months, since the night she found her father weeping at his desk, and he finally told her the truth. The real truth, not the version he'd been showing the world. The debts, the failed investments, the loans he'd taken against the land without telling anyone, the name of the man he owed most of it to. The farm, she said. The farm? He agreed. The outbuildings, the eastern pasture. And if the full amount cannot be settled within 30 days, the house itself. He paused. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Whitmore. Your father was a decent man. He was, she said. He was also a man who made mistakes he didn't know how to correct. But the mistakes were not entirely his own making. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Not much. Just a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind a man does when he hears something he didn't expect. I'd invite you in, Eleanor said. But the kitchen's in a state. I've been working. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to show you something first if you're willing, before we talk about what you've come to take. Nathaniel Carter studied her for a moment. In his experience, people in debt fell into 2 categories, the ones who begged and the ones who disappeared. He had never in his professional life encountered a woman standing in a barn doorway looking at him the way this one was. Not with hatred, not with fear, but with the particular calm of someone who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. Show me, he said. She took him to the barn first. Not the main barn, the smaller one at the back of the property, the one the farmhands never used. She had cleaned it out 3 months ago after the funeral. She'd moved everything she needed into it. The secondary ledgers, the correspondence. The records she had been quietly keeping since she was 21 years old, and first understood that the numbers her father was reporting to the county were not the numbers she was living inside. Nathaniel followed her without comment. His driver stayed with the carriage. The man knew his employer well enough not to ask questions. Inside the barn, Eleanor had set up a work table. Stacked on it were 3 bound ledgers, a box of correspondence, and a separate folder of documents she had organized by date. "My father came to you for a loan," she said. 2 loans, actually. The first in 1814, the second in 1816. Combined, the principal was $4,000. $4,200, Nathaniel said. "Yes." She opened the first ledger. "I'd like you to look at what that money was supposed to do." He came to the table. She turned the pages, slowly running her finger along the columns. "He bought seed," she said. "He hired 3 additional farmhands. He repaired the irrigation on the east pasture, which hadn't worked properly since 1809. All of it was documented. All of it made sense as an investment." She turned to the next section. "Now I'd like you to look at what actually happened." Nathaniel leaned over the table. He had been in business for 15 years. He knew how to read a ledger, and what he saw in Eleanor Whitmore's cramped, precise handwriting stopped him cold. The revenues from the east pasture, which should have increased after the irrigation repair, had actually dropped, significantly, for 2 consecutive seasons. The harvest yields recorded in the county tax filings were nearly 40% lower than what Eleanor's own tallies showed. "Where did you get these numbers?" he asked. "I counted myself. Every harvest for 3 years. I kept my own books separate from my father's." She looked at him. "Mr. Carter, the money you lent my father did not disappear into bad luck. It disappeared into someone else's pocket." The silence in the barn was total. "You're saying someone was stealing from your father." "I'm saying someone was stealing from this farm for at least 4 years. And I believe my father knew eventually, but by the time he understood what was happening, he was already too embarrassed to tell anyone. He'd borrowed money he now couldn't repay because the profits that should have repaid it had been redirected." She closed the ledger. "His debt to you is real. I'm not disputing that. But the reason that debt exists is not negligence or foolishness. It's fraud." Nathaniel straightened. He looked at her. She held his gaze. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Yes, sir, it is." "Against who?" Eleanor set a single letter on top of the closed ledger. She had deliberated about this moment for months. She had rewritten her argument a dozen times in her head, and she had known from the beginning that this was the moment everything would either move forward or collapse. "Charles Beaumont," she said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Charles Beaumont was not just a neighboring landowner. He was the largest property holder in the county after Nathaniel Carter himself. He was on the board of the local bank. He had been a personal acquaintance of the county judge for 20 years. His family had been in Virginia since before the Revolution. He was by every measure that Albemarle County used to calculate worth untouchable. Nathaniel did not move for a long moment. "That is a very serious accusation," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "I know. Do you understand what it means to accuse a man like Beaumont without proof that would hold in a court of law?" "I have proof," Eleanor said, "or the beginning of it. That letter," she nodded toward the paper on the table, "is from Beaumont to my father dated spring of 1815. It references an arrangement regarding the Eastern harvest. My father signed it. Beaumont signed it. And the arrangement it describes would explain exactly why the revenue I was tracking never matched the revenue my father was reporting." Nathaniel picked up the letter. He read it once, then he read it again. Eleanor watched his face. She was good at reading faces. She had learned it young in a household where the things people didn't say were usually more important than the things they did. "This isn't enough," he said finally. "I know. One letter establishing an arrangement, Beaumont's lawyers would argue it was legitimate business. You'd need more." "I have more," she said. "But I need time to get it, and I need the farm not to be taken out from under me while I gather it." She met his eyes. "I'm asking for 60 days, Mr. Carter. Not a forgiveness of the debt, not charity. 60 days to build a case that would hold up. If I can't do it, I'll sign whatever you need me to sign and I'll walk away. but I am asking you not to take this land until you've seen what I've found." Nathaniel Carter set the letter down. He was a man who did not make decisions quickly. That was one of the things people said about him, one of the things that had made him what he was. He never acted on emotion. He never moved on instinct alone. He calculated. He verified. He waited until he was certain. But standing in this cramped back barn in the middle of a Virginia summer, looking at a 24-year-old woman who had buried her father 2 weeks ago and spent the time since organizing evidence against the most powerful man in the county, he found himself doing something he almost never did. He was genuinely uncertain what to think. "Who else knows about this?" he asked. "No one." "Not your farmhands. They saw me counting harvests. They didn't know what I was doing with the numbers." "Not anyone in town?" "No." She paused. "If I had told anyone in town, it would have reached Beaumont within a week. And if Beaumont knew I was building a case against him, I wouldn't have made it this far." "You've been doing this alone?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Why not find someone, an attorney, a male relative, someone who could—" "Because there is no one," she said, and her voice was flat and even and did not ask for sympathy. "My father is dead. My mother died when I was 12. I have a cousin in Kentucky who I haven't spoken to in 4 years. There is no attorney in this county who would take a case against Beaumont on behalf of a woman with no money and no social standing. And there is no man I could bring into this who would not within a month be the one making the decisions instead of me." She lifted her chin. "So I did it myself. I've been doing it myself for 3 years, and I'd like to keep doing it if you'll give me the 60 days. Nathaniel left the barn without giving her an answer. He walked back to his carriage, said something in a low voice to his driver, and then stood with his back to the farmhouse for several minutes, looking out at the east pasture Eleanor's father had borrowed money to fix. Eleanor watched from the barn doorway. She did not call after him. She did not push. She had said everything she intended to say, and now it was his choice to make. That was the part she couldn't control, and she had made her peace with that, or tried to. When he turned around, his face was unreadable. "I'll need to take the ledgers," he said. "The ones you showed me. I'll have my own man review them." "I'll make copies first," she said. "I'm not giving away the originals." His mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression a man makes when he's surprised, and he's trying not to show it, and he fails just slightly. "Fair enough," he said. "You have 2 weeks. If my man confirms what your numbers are showing, I'll give you the 60 days. He held up a hand before she could speak. "That is not a promise of debt forgiveness. It is not a guarantee of any outcome. It is 2 weeks for verification, and then, if warranted, 60 days for you to build your case. After that, whatever the law decides we abide by." "That's all I'm asking," Eleanor said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He turned toward the carriage. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. "In 15 years of collecting debts," he said, "I have never walked into a situation like this one." He paused. "I'm not sure what to make of you." Eleanor looked back at him. "With respect, Mr. Carter," she said, "you don't need to make anything of me yet. You just need to read the numbers." He rode away without another word. Eleanor stood in the heat and watched the dust rise behind his carriage and settle again over the road. Then she walked back to the barn, sat down at her work table, and started making copies. She worked until past midnight, the lantern burning low. Her hand cramped. Her back ached. The summer heat didn't break even after sundown, and the small barn held the warmth of the day like a closed oven. She drank water from a tin cup, refilled it twice, and kept writing. She had promised herself she would not think about what would happen if Nathaniel Carter's man found a way to dismiss her numbers. She had promised herself she would not think about Beaumont, about the way he'd smiled at her father's funeral, the brief pressure of his hand on her arm, as he'd told her he was sorry for her loss, the way his eyes had moved over the farmhouse with something that was not sympathy. She had promised herself she would stay on the task directly in front of her, But human beings are not very good at keeping promises to themselves at midnight, alone in a barn, with everything they have left sitting in a stack of ledgers on a work table. She thought about her father. Thomas Whitmore had not been a strong man in the end. He had not been a bad man either. He was a man who'd loved the land he'd inherited, who'd wanted to do right by it, who'd trusted the wrong person, because trusting was how he was built. He had signed an arrangement with Charles Beaumont because Beaumont was charming and well-connected, and because her father had needed help in a difficult season, and had not seen, could not have imagined, that the help came with a hand in his pocket. By the time he understood it, the shame of it had nearly broken him. The debt to Nathaniel Carter weighed on him, not because he feared losing the farm, though he did, but because he had built his life on the idea that a man's word and a man's work were worth something. Discovering they had been used against him had taken something out of him that never came back. Eleanor had watched it happen and been helpless to stop it. She could count harvests. She could keep books. She could see the pattern in the numbers that her father couldn't bear to look at. But she was a woman in 1817 Virginia, and the things she could see and the things she was permitted to do about what she saw were not the same list. Until now. She flexed her hand, dipped her pen, and kept writing. 3 days later, a rider arrived from Nathaniel Carter's estate. Not Carter himself. A younger man, maybe 30, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an ink stain on his right hand, and the careful, precise bearing of someone who worked with numbers for a living. He introduced himself as James Caldwell, Mr. Carter's accountant. "Mr. Carter asked me to spend some time reviewing the documents you showed him," Caldwell said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. "He said you'd be expecting me." "I am." Eleanor stepped back. "Come in." She took him to the work table. She had the copies ready organized the same way she'd organized the originals, but she kept the originals in a separate box that she did not put on the table. Caldwell sat down and began to read. He was quiet for a long time. Eleanor worked nearby, mending a fence piece that had been broken for weeks close enough to be available if he had questions far enough to give him room. She had learned early that men who were being asked to take her seriously did better when she didn't hover. After 2 hours, Caldwell looked up. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How long did it take you to put this together?" 3 years roughly, but most of it came together in the last 8 months. After I found the Beaumont letter. He was quiet again. He turned back to the ledgers. "The discrepancy in the east pasture yield," he said. "In 1815. The difference between what you recorded and what was reported to the county." "Yes. That's not a small error. That's not a bad season. That's—" He paused. "Do you have any other records of what the east pasture was actually producing? Anything outside your own counting?" Eleanor reached into the box she'd kept to herself and produced a different folder. "The seed company," she said. "We bought from the same supplier for 8 years. I wrote to them last fall and asked for copies of our purchase records going back to 1812. The yields I was tracking match our seed purchases almost exactly. The yields being reported to the county do not." Caldwell stared at the folder. "That's—" he said and stopped. "Corroboration," Eleanor said. "From an independent source." He looked at her over his spectacles. He had the look of a man who had just been handed something he didn't know how to categorize. "Mr. Carter is going to want to see this," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I kept it." Nathaniel Carter came back to the farm himself 4 days later. He came alone this time without the driver. He tied his horse at the post and walked to the barn without knocking at the farmhouse, which told Eleanor he had already decided something. She was at the work table. She heard his boots on the ground and did not look up. "Caldwell gave you his report," she said. "This morning." He came to stand across the table from her. He said, and I am quoting here, that in 20 years of reviewing accounts, he had never seen a private citizen maintain records with that level of consistency and precision. Eleanor set down her pen. "And," she said, "and the seed company correspondence changes everything." Nathaniel pulled out the chair across the table and sat down, which surprised her. He had not sat down the first time. That's not circumstantial anymore, Miss Whitmore. That's documentary evidence of a systematic discrepancy between actual production and reported production over multiple seasons in a time frame that aligns exactly with your father's financial decline. Yes, it doesn't prove Beaumont was involved, not yet. That letter alone won't hold in a court. I know, but it proves something was wrong. And it proves my father was not simply a poor businessman who borrowed money he couldn't repay. She looked at him. It proves there's something here worth investigating. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You have 60 days, he said. Starting today, the farm stays as it is. No collection action, no legal proceedings. He set a paper on the table between them. This is a written agreement to that effect. I'll need your signature. Eleanor looked at the paper. She read it. She read it again. This says you retain the right to inspect all financial documents during the 60-day period, she said. It does. And that you can terminate the agreement if you believe evidence is being withheld. Yes. She looked up. What are you actually agreeing to here, Mr. Carter? Because this reads like you're not just pausing collection. You're opening an investigation. I am, he said simply. Why? He met her eyes. Because if Charles Beaumont has been running this kind of scheme on one farm, he said, I need to know whether he's been running it on others, including mine. The room went very still. Eleanor hadn't considered that. She had been so focused on her father's land, on her father's debt, on proving her father's innocence, it hadn't occurred to her that she might not be the only one. You think he's done this before? She said. I think, Nathaniel said carefully, that a man who is willing to do this once rarely stops at once. He looked at the ledgers stacked on her table. And I think you've built something here that might be the start of proving it. He paused. I'd like to know whether you're willing to let me help you. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She had come to this barn to fight alone. She had planned for alone. She had built every inch of her strategy around the assumption that alone was all she would ever have. You're not doing this out of generosity, she said. No, he agreed. You want Beaumont as much as I do. Possibly more, he said, though for different reasons. She looked down at the paper on the table. Then she picked up her pen. Then we'd better get started, she said. And she signed her name. The ink on Eleanor's signature was barely dry before Nathaniel Carter pulled a second document from his coat pocket. She looked at it without reaching for it. What is that? She said. A letter of instruction to my estate manager. He set it on the table beside the signed agreement. He'll be sending over access to 3 years of Carter Farm's harvest records, eastern boundary parcels, specifically the ones that share a fence line with Beaumont's property. Eleanor stared at him. You already suspected something. I suspected something last year, he said. I didn't have a reason to move on it. You just gave me one. She picked up the letter and read it. Every line was precise, measured, the handwriting of a man who did not waste words on paper any more than he wasted them in conversation. You had your own numbers that didn't add up, she said slowly. 2 seasons of yield reports that came in below what my foreman expected. I attributed it to weather, to rotation issues. He paused. I should have looked harder. Why didn't you? Because Beaumont is a difficult man to look at directly, Nathaniel said. When you look at a man like that, he looks back. And whatever he sees, he remembers. He met her eyes. You understand what I'm saying? I understand completely, Eleanor said. I've been careful for 3 years for exactly that reason. They looked at each other across the work table. Something shifted in the room, then not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories where people suddenly understand everything at once. It was quieter than that. It was the particular shift that happens when 2 people who have each been working alone in the dark realize they can see a little farther in the same direction. I'll need a list, Eleanor said, reaching for her pen. Every parcel on your eastern boundary. The name of each field, the crop rotation you were running, the expected yield by your foreman's estimate, and the reported yield for the last 3 seasons. You'll have it by Friday. And I'll need the name of the man who actually counted your harvest, not your manager, the man in the field. Nathaniel looked at her. Why? Because if Beaumont was skimming your yields, He needed someone on the inside to do it. Your manager may have been deceived the same way my father was. But whoever actually counted the grain before it was recorded, that man either knows something or he was replaced in the seasons the numbers went wrong. She looked up from her paper. One of those two things is true. I'd like to know which. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. His name is Roy Perkins, he said. He's been with the farm 11 years. And the 2 seasons the numbers came in low, he counted both times. Then I'd like to talk to him. That, Nathaniel said, may not be simple. Nothing about this is simple, Eleanor said. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for a name and permission to have a conversation. He stood. He put his hat on. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the first day, that same careful measuring look, the one that she'd initially read as skepticism and was beginning to think might be something else entirely. I'll send Roy Perkins here on Saturday morning, he said. I'll tell him only that a neighbor has bookkeeping questions. Nothing else. That's enough, Eleanor said. Thank you. He nodded once and walked out. Eleanor put down her pen, pressed both hands flat on the table, and exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. Then she picked the pen back up and started making the list of questions she intended to ask Roy Perkins. Sure. Roy Perkins arrived Saturday just after dawn, which told her Nathaniel had told him to come early, which told her Nathaniel had told him more than bookkeeping questions. He was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s, with calloused hands and the specific wariness of someone who has been asked questions before and didn't enjoy the experience. He stood in the yard with his hat against his chest and looked at Eleanor the way men in Albemarle County tended to look at her these days, like they weren't quite sure whether to feel sorry for her or cautious of her. Mr. Perkins, she said, come in. I made coffee. She had learned over 3 years of quietly gathering information that coffee was worth more than a formal introduction. Men talked more freely when they were holding something warm. He sat at the kitchen table. She poured. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and did not reach for the ledger she had placed just out of sight on the counter. I appreciate you coming, she said. I know it's early. Mr. Carter asked me to, Perkins said. He wasn't rude exactly, just careful. Said you had questions. I do, and I want to be honest with you about what kind of questions they are because I think you deserve that. She looked at him steadily. I'm looking into a discrepancy in harvest records, on this farm and possibly on Mr. Carter's as well. I'm not looking to get anyone in trouble who doesn't deserve to be. But I need to understand what was actually happening in the fields during the 1815 and 1816 harvests on the Carter Eastern parcels. Perkins's jaw tightened slightly. I counted those harvests myself. I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you specifically. She kept her voice even. No accusation in it, just information. Were there other people present during the count? Anyone from outside the Carter farm? He looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands. Beaumont sent a man, he said. Eleanor did not move. He sent a man both years, Perkins continued, his voice lower now. Said it was a new county practice, an independent observer for large harvest counts. Said the county judge had authorized it. He looked up. I had no reason to think that wasn't true. Judge Harlan and Beaumont have been friends since before I was farming. Did this man, Beaumont's man, handle any of the recording? He offered to. Perkins set down his cup. I let him record the second count while I was moving between fields. It was a big harvest. I was stretched thin. He paused. Did something go wrong in the recording? Eleanor reached for the ledger then. She opened it to the page she'd already marked and turned it to face him. This is what Mr. Carter's records show for those 2 seasons, she said. And this, she pointed to a separate column she'd added in red ink, is what the seed purchase history and expected yield would project for the same parcels. Perkins stared at the numbers for a long time. That's not right, he said quietly. That's not right at all. We had a strong yield both those years, especially the East 40. He pointed to a specific row. This number that's less than half of what we brought in. I know, Eleanor said. The silence stretched between them. That man, Perkins said. His voice had gone flat. The one Beaumont sent. Yes. He recorded short. That's what I believe. Perkins pushed back from the table. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment. Eleanor waited. She was good at waiting. I'm going to need to tell Mr. Carter, Perkins said. He already knows something is wrong, Eleanor said. He doesn't know the mechanism yet. What you just told me about Beaumont's man, about him handling the recording, that's a piece he didn't have. Perkins turned around. His face had the look of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of the last several years. How long has this been going on? He said. I believe at least 4 years, possibly longer. He stared at her. On this farm too. The Whitmore farm. My father's numbers went wrong starting in 1813, the same year Beaumont made his first offer to buy the eastern pasture, and my father said no. She paused. My father said no 3 times before the debt made it impossible for him to say no anymore. Perkins sat back down. He picked up his coffee cup again, not to drink from it, just to have something to hold. What do you need from me? He said. A written statement, Eleanor said. What you just told me the man Beaumont sent, what he recorded, what years, what you observed. As much detail as you can remember. She met his eyes. I know that's not a small thing to put your name on. No, he said. It ain't. He was quiet for a moment. But if Beaumont's been stealing from Mr. Carter and from your family, and God knows who else. He stopped. My daddy farmed this county his whole life. He always said the worst thing a man can do is let a dishonest man keep going because speaking up seems hard. He set down the cup. Where do you want me to sign? Me too, Hank. By the end of the second week, Eleanor had 3 things she hadn't had before. She had Roy Perkins's signed statement, 8 pages of it, written in his slow, careful handwriting, and detailing everything he remembered about both harvest seasons, including a physical description of the man Beaumont had sent. A man he now recalled had also been present on 2 of the Whitmore farm's joint field days in 1814. She had Nathaniel Carter's Eastern parcel records delivered as promised, and reviewed by her over 4 consecutive evenings with a precision that left her with ink-stained fingers and a growing certainty that the pattern was not random, not accidental, and not limited to the Whitmore farm. And she had a name. The man Beaumont had sent, whose name Perkins remembered because he'd made a point of introducing himself both times with the particular friendliness of someone establishing a reason to be trusted, was a man called Douglas Webb. Eleanor wrote the name at the top of a fresh page in her personal notebook and sat looking at it for a long time. Webb. Not a name she recognized. Not a local name. Someone brought in from outside. She wrote 2 words beneath the name, find him. Nathaniel came to the farm again on a Wednesday unannounced. Eleanor was in the yard when she heard the horse, and she looked up from the barrel she was sealing and watched him ride in with the specific alertness of someone carrying information they haven't decided how to deliver yet. Webb is real, he said before he'd fully dismounted. Eleanor straightened. You found him. My man in Richmond found him. Douglas Webb, formerly employed as a land surveyor and county recorder out of Lynchburg. He tied the horse and came across the yard to stand a few feet from her. His voice was low, not quite quiet, but controlled in the way his voice always was. He moved to Richmond in 1816. He currently works for a land acquisition firm. Let me guess, Eleanor said. Beaumont has a silent partnership in the firm, Nathaniel said. 40% stake. Established 1815, the year the skimming started on Carter land. Eleanor turned and walked to the barn. Not because she needed anything in it, because she needed a moment where she was moving, and not just standing in the open absorbing what that meant. Nathaniel followed her. He's been building a portfolio, she said once she was inside and her voice could be a little steadier. Beaumont. He finds farms that are viable, drives their income down artificially through the harvest scheme, lets the owners fall into debt, then positions himself to acquire the land at a fraction of its real value. She turned to face him. Your land and my land aren't the only ones. No, Nathaniel said. They're not. My man in Richmond found transfer records for 3 other properties in the last 6 years. All of them formerly healthy farms. All of them sold under financial duress to the same land acquisition firm. 3 other families. 3 other men who had probably sat at a desk somewhere the way her father had and felt the ground going out from under them and not understood why. This is bigger than my father's debt, Eleanor said. Considerably, which means it's bigger than a county judge can handle quietly, she said. This would need to go to the state, possibly further. Yes. She looked at him. That frightens you. It complicates things significantly, he said, which was not the same thing as yes, but was close enough to it that she let it stand. What frightens me, Eleanor said, is that Beaumont will find out we're looking before we have enough to move. He has friends in this county in places that matter. If he hears even a rumor. She stopped. How many people know what you found in Richmond? My man, myself. Now you. Does Caldwell know? Not yet. Keep it that way, she said. For now. The fewer people who know, the better. She started pacing a short, tight line across the barn and back. We need the original recording ledgers from the county harvest filings. The official ones, the ones Beaumont's man would have submitted after each count. If we can get those and compare them to what Perkins says the actual yield was. Those records are kept at the county office, Nathaniel said. I know where they're kept. They're not publicly accessible. I know that too. She stopped pacing. Do you know the county clerk? Nathaniel looked at her. Thomas Aldridge. Yes, he's a methodical man, follows procedure. Does he follow Beaumont? A pause. No. Aldridge and Beaumont have never been warm. Beaumont tried to have him replaced 2 years ago. Failed. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope. Something more careful than hope. The particular feeling of a door that might open if you approached it correctly. I'd like to speak to Aldridge, she said. Not you, me. Why not me? Because if you go to him about Beaumont, it reads as a business dispute between powerful men. He'll be cautious. He'll protect himself. She looked at Nathaniel directly. If I go to him, a woman whose father just died in debt who has questions about harvest filings, it reads differently. He won't see a threat. He'll see someone who needs information. Nathaniel was quiet. That's, he started. Accurate, she said. I was going to say calculated. It's both, she said evenly. Is it wrong? He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. It's not wrong. Another pause. Aldridge will see you on a Tuesday. He takes a late lunch on Tuesdays, and the office is quieter. I'll send a note saying you're a client of mine with a question about property records. Don't say client, Eleanor said. Say neighbor. He almost smiled again. That same almost the one she'd seen the first day and was beginning to think was the closest he got. Neighbor, he said. Tuesday. Thomas Aldridge was a small man with a large desk and the deeply ingrained habit of speaking to women as though they had wandered into his office by mistake, and he was patiently waiting for them to realize it. Eleanor shook his hand, sat down without being invited to, and opened her notebook. She had been careful about what she wore, not her best dress that would read as trying too hard, not her work clothes that would read as someone who didn't expect to be taken seriously, the middle dress, the one that said competent, not wealthy. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Aldridge, she said. I'll be brief. I'm trying to understand the process for county harvest filings, specifically how a submitted record is verified. Aldridge settled back in his chair. What specifically are you trying to understand, Miss Whitmore? Whether a filing once submitted can be amended, and if so, by whom? He looked at her carefully. May I ask why? My father submitted filings for 3 years that I believe contained errors, she said. I'm not sure if the errors were his or whether the figures were altered after submission. I'd like to know how that could be determined. You're suggesting someone altered your father's filings. I'm asking whether it's possible. She looked at him steadily. I don't want to make accusations I can't support. I'm asking a procedural question first. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. He turned a pen over in his fingers twice. The original submissions are kept in the archive, he said slowly. They're dated and initialed at receipt. If an amendment was submitted later, there would be a separate amendment record with a second date and a second set of initials. He paused. If you were comparing the original and an amendment, you'd be able to see exactly when the change was made and who submitted it. Eleanor did not move. She kept her expression neutral, but her heart was beating faster. And could a person say a neighbor who had been present at the filing submit an amendment? Only with written authorization from the original filer. Another pause. Or with authorization from a county official. Eleanor looked at him. He looked back at her. Mr. Aldridge, she said quietly, do you have amendments in your archive for Whitmore Farm filings from 1814 and 1815? The silence that followed was the longest she had sat through since this whole thing began. Aldridge set down his pen. He stood up without a word and walked to the back of his office. Eleanor heard a drawer open, the sound of files being moved. A long pause. He came back to the desk with a thin folder. He set it down between them and opened it. There were 2 amendment records, one for 1814, one for 1815, both signed. Both dated 3 weeks after the original filings. The name on the authorization line was not her father's. It was Judge Harlan. Eleanor stared at the page. Her father had not altered those records. He hadn't even known they were altered. Someone had used the county judge's authority to go into the official record and change the numbers after her father had filed them correctly. Her father had been filing the right numbers. They had been changed. She looked up at Aldridge. He was watching her with an expression that was no longer distant. It was the expression of a man who has been sitting on something uncomfortable for a long time and has just found someone he might be able to hand it to. Mr. Aldridge, she said, how long have you known about these amendments? He was quiet for a moment. Long enough, he said, that I moved the original filings to a separate location from the general archive when I noticed the discrepancy. He met her eyes. I didn't know what to do with them, Miss Whitmore. Harlan is the county judge. Beaumont is the wealthiest man in the county. And I am a county clerk with a wife and 3 children. I understand that, Eleanor said. I'm not judging you for waiting. But you're not going to let it stay waiting, he said. No, she said. I'm not. She looked at the folder. May I ask you to make copies of both amendments and the originals? If the originals are somewhere separate. I can have copies made, he said. Today, if you need them. I need them, she said. He nodded. He closed the folder. He looked at her one more time before he stood. Miss Whitmore, he said, I hope you know what you're stepping into. I know exactly what I'm stepping into, Eleanor said. I've been planning this for 3 years. The difference is that now I'm not stepping into it alone. She brought the copies to Nathaniel that evening. She rode to his estate for the first time, the long drive lined with old oak trees, the main house at the end of it larger than she'd imagined, though she hadn't let herself imagine it much. She was shown into a study by a young man who clearly wasn't sure what to make of her arriving unannounced, and she waited there for 4 minutes before Nathaniel came in. He stopped when he saw her face. What did you find? He said. She set the copies on his desk. My father was submitting correct numbers, she said. Someone was amending the official filings after the fact, using Judge Harlan's authorization. Nathaniel came to the desk. He picked up the copies. He read them. The color in his face changed. Harlan, he said. I don't think Harlan initiated it, Eleanor said. I think Beaumont used him. Whether Harlan understood fully what he was signing, or whether he was manipulated himself, I don't know yet. But his name is on the authorization line. She paused. This changes things. It changes everything, Nathaniel said quietly. He set the papers down. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and stood very still for a moment. This isn't just fraud between private parties anymore. This is the corruption of official county records. That's a state-level offense. Yes. Which means we need someone above the county level before we move. Yes. Which means we need to be further along than we are before anyone in this county who's connected to either Beaumont or Harlan hears a single word about what we're building. She looked at him. We need more farms, Nathaniel. More examples. Beaumont has done this at least 5 times that we know of. We need 2 or 3 of those other property owners to come forward with their records. He looked up at the use of his first name. She hadn't used it before. She wasn't sure she'd meant to use it now. Neither of them remarked on it. I know one of the other owners, he said. James Tanner. Lost his property in 1814. I always thought it was bad management, but after what Perkins told you, can you reach him? He moved to Kentucky, but I have an address. He picked up the amendment copies again. If I show him these, don't show him those yet, Eleanor said sharply. If he talks to anyone who talks to anyone, Beaumont will know we have county records. We need to get his account first. Let him tell us what happened in his own words before he knows what we found. That way his testimony and our records corroborate each other independently. She paused. It's stronger that way. A lawyer will tell you that. 2 independent accounts pointing to the same conclusion is worth 10 times one account and a document. Nathaniel stared at her. Where did you learn to think like that? He said. From 3 years of doing this alone, she said, and knowing that if I made a mistake, there was no one to catch it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. I'll write to Tanner tonight, he said. Eleanor picked up her copies, folded them carefully, and tucked them back inside her coat. There's one more thing, she said. Beaumont made an offer on this farm last week. Nathaniel went very still. He made an offer. A written offer, delivered by messenger. Very polite, very formal. She looked at him. He wants to buy Whitmore Farm. He called it a fair price given current circumstances. He's moving faster, Nathaniel said. He knows my father is gone. He knows the debt exists. He's expecting me to be desperate. She paused. I think he also knows you gave me 60 days, and he's trying to get ahead of whatever he thinks you're doing. Does he know we're working together? I don't think so. Not yet. She met his eyes. But he will. Someone will see something eventually. We need to move before that happens. How much time do we have? I don't know, she said honestly. But I'd guess less than we think. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. He was still standing at the desk, the copies of the amendments just below his hands, looking at her with that careful, measuring expression she was beginning to understand was not skepticism at all. It was the look of a man who was used to being the smartest person in any room he entered, confronting the realization that he might not be. Get that letter to Tanner tonight, she said. And she walked out into the dark summer evening, already thinking about what came next. James Tanner's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Nathaniel had sent his own. Eleanor was at the work table when Nathaniel rode in with it. He didn't dismount. He just held it out to her from the saddle, and the look on his face told her everything before she even broke the seal. She read it standing in the yard. Tanner's handwriting was shaky in places. The handwriting of a man who had spent years trying not to think about something and was now being asked to think about it very carefully. But the details were clear, precise. He described 2 harvest seasons on his property in which an outside observer had been present, a man sent by the county agricultural committee he'd been told. He described yields that had felt wrong to him, numbers that didn't match what his workers had carried in from the fields. He described a debt that had grown faster than he could account for. And he described in the second-to-last paragraph the moment Charles Beaumont had arrived at his door with a purchase offer. The offer had been, in Tanner's words, generous enough to make a drowning man think it was a life raft. He had signed. He had moved his family to Kentucky. He had spent 3 years telling himself it was bad luck and bad management. At the bottom of the letter in handwriting that steadied as it went, he had written, "If someone is finally looking into this, I will come back to Virginia and say everything I know in front of whoever needs to hear it. Just tell me when." Eleanor folded the letter. "He'll testify," she said. "He'll testify," Nathaniel confirmed. She looked up at him. "That's 3 independent accounts now, Perkins Tanner and the Aldridge records, all pointing at the same mechanism, all pointing at the same man." "It's enough to go to the state," Nathaniel said. "Or it will be with one more thing." "Webb," she said. "Webb," he agreed. Douglas Webb, the man Beaumont had sent to count harvests and record them short. The man who had moved to Richmond. The man who worked for the land acquisition firm Beaumont held a silent stake in. The man who was the living connection between every piece of evidence they'd assembled and the person who had designed the scheme. Without Webb, or without someone who could place Webb directly in Beaumont's employ during the relevant years, what they had was a pattern. A compelling, well-documented damning pattern. But patterns required interpretation. Webb was a fact. "Has your man in Richmond found anything more on him?" Eleanor asked. "He has a current address," Nathaniel said. "Webb is still in Richmond, still at the firm." He paused. "He's getting married in the fall. He has a house. He has a life he apparently believes is stable." "Then he's afraid of losing it," Eleanor said immediately. Nathaniel looked at her. "You're thinking about approaching him." "I'm thinking he doesn't know we exist," she said. "He recorded some harvest numbers years ago and moved on. He has no reason to believe anyone is ever going to knock on his door about it." She met Nathaniel's eyes. "Which means, if someone does knock on his door the right way, with the right information already in hand, he might talk before he thinks about whether he should." "That's a significant risk. Everything we've done is a significant risk." She handed the Tanner letter back to him. "I'll go to Richmond." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Alone. "You can't go. Beaumont will have someone watching your movements, or he will soon if he doesn't already. A trip to Richmond from you right now raises questions." She kept her voice steady. "I have no profile. I'm a woman who just lost her father. People expect me to be dealing with practical matters. A trip to Richmond is entirely unremarkable." He looked at her for a long time. "I don't like this," he said. "You don't have to like it," she said. "You just have to not stop me." Another silence. Then, "You'll take my driver. Not as escort, as transportation. You're a client traveling on business. That's the story." "Agreed. And you'll send word the moment you've spoken to Webb, before you travel back." "Agreed." He finally dismounted then. He stood in the yard with the reins in his hand and looked at her with that expression she'd spent the better part of a month trying to accurately read, and still wasn't entirely sure she had right. "Be careful," he said. It came out quieter than his other words, less controlled. "I'm always careful," Eleanor said. "That's how I'm still standing." Sound. Richmond was 3 days' travel. She used the first day to go over every piece of information she had on Douglas Webb. The second day she spent thinking through every possible way the conversation could go wrong and what she would do in each case. The third day, she didn't think about it at all, because by then she had planned as much as planning could accomplish, and the rest would depend on the man himself. Webb's office was a narrow building in a commercial street near the river. She arrived at mid-morning when the street was busy enough that one woman walking into one building was entirely unremarkable. The young man at the front desk looked up when she entered. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Douglas Webb," she said. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm from Albemarle County. I believe he'll know why I'm here." She had debated the last sentence for 3 days. It was a gamble Webb might know nothing about her specifically, in which case the claim was a small, harmless misdirection. Or he might, if Beaumont had been watching the situation at all, know exactly who she was. Either way, it would produce a reaction. And reactions told you things. The young man disappeared. Eleanor waited. 3 minutes. Long enough to suggest Webb had needed the 3 minutes. He came out from the back corridor, looking like a man who had dressed carefully for a day he hadn't expected to involve anything more complicated than ledger work. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s, sandy-haired with the soft hands of someone who had not been in the fields for a long time. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. "Mr. Webb," she said. "Thank you for seeing me. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" He led her to a back office. He closed the door. He did not sit down, which meant he did not intend for this to be a long conversation. He intended to say very little, size her up, and send her away. Eleanor understood that. She sat down anyway without being invited and opened her notebook. "I'll be direct with you," she said, "because I think you'll appreciate directness more than anything else right now." She looked up at him. "I have Perkins's statement. I have the Aldridge records, including the amendment filings with Judge Harlan's authorization. I have James Tanner's written account. And I have the registration documents for the land acquisition firm showing Mr. Beaumont's 40% stake." She paused. "What I don't yet have is the direct link between you and Beaumont during the years you were present at those harvest counts. I'd like your help filling that gap." Webb stared at her. The color in his face had gone wrong. "I don't know what you're—" "Mr. Webb." Her voice stayed level. "I am not here representing the county. I'm not here representing law enforcement. I'm a private citizen with a dead father, a farm I'm trying to keep, and a 3-year record of every number that went wrong and why." She held his gaze. "I'm also not trying to put you in prison. I'm trying to put Charles Beaumont in a courtroom. Those are different goals, and the difference between them may matter a great deal to a man who has a house and a wedding planned for the fall." The silence in the room was total. Webb sat down. He sat down slowly, like a man whose legs had made a decision his brain was still catching up to. He put both hands on the desk in front of him and looked at them. "How much do you actually have?" he said quietly. "Enough to build the case without you," she said honestly, "but not enough to close it quickly. Without your account, this goes to the state and works its way through the system for 2 or 3 years. And during that time, Beaumont stays operational, continues acquiring properties, and continues making the lives of farming families in this county very difficult." She paused. "With your account, we can move within weeks. And the name that goes in front of the court is Beaumont's, not yours." Webb looked up. "You can promise me that?" "I can tell you that the man working with me on this is Nathaniel Carter, and that Nathaniel Carter's word in Virginia carries more legal and social weight than almost anyone else's." She met his eyes. "He wants Beaumont. He does not want you." Another silence. "I was paid to observe counts and record what I was told to record," Webb said. His voice was flat, the voice of a man giving a statement he has already decided to give and is trying not to feel too much about while he does it. "I was told it was a commission arrangement. Standard business. The numbers I filed were the numbers Beaumont gave me, not the numbers from the count. I knew they were different. I told myself it was a private business arrangement between Beaumont and the property owners." He stopped. "I knew that wasn't true by the 2nd year, but by then I was already—" He stopped again. "I was already in too far to see how to get out." "I understand," Eleanor said. "Do you—" "My father felt the same way," she said quietly. "About a different part of the same scheme. He knew something was wrong long before he admitted it to himself, and by the time he did, the shame of knowing and not acting had become its own kind of prison." She paused. "You're not your worst decision, Mr. Webb, but you are responsible for what you do with it from here." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "A written statement," she said. "The same thing you just told me with as much detail as you can add dates, locations, what Beaumont told you to record, what you actually counted, and how you were paid." She opened her notebook to a fresh page and slid it across the desk with her pen. "You can write it yourself or dictate it to me. Either way." Webb looked at the blank page. He picked up the pen. He wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. Want. She sent the word to Nathaniel from Richmond before she left. We have Webb. The message she got back, delivered to her at the inn before she boarded the carriage, was 3 words in Nathaniel Carter's precise handwriting: "Come home carefully." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it inside her coat, close to where she kept the signed copy of Webb's statement, and she did not examine too carefully what it felt like to have someone tell her to come home carefully. She had work to do. She kept her mind there. But the journey back was where things began to fall apart. She was 2 hours outside of Richmond, the road cutting through a stretch of thick summer woods, when the carriage slowed unexpectedly. She heard the driver exchange words with someone outside, then a long pause. Then the driver's voice uncertain. "Miss Whitmore, someone on the road says they have a message from Mr. Carter." Eleanor's hand went to her coat pocket before she thought about it. The man outside the carriage was not someone she'd ever seen before. Young, broad-shouldered, with the easy, relaxed posture of someone who was not particularly concerned about what happened next. He held out a letter. "Mr. Carter asked me to deliver this personally," he said. Eleanor did not reach for it. "Mr. Carter gave you this letter personally," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "When?" A slight pause. "This morning." "Then how did you know where to find my carriage on this road?" Another pause. Longer this time. Eleanor looked at the driver. The driver looked straight ahead. "Thank you," she said to the man with the letter. "I'll let Mr. Carter know I received it." She told the driver to move on. They drove in silence for half a mile. Then Eleanor said, "How much did he pay you to slow down on that stretch?" The driver didn't answer immediately. $10, he said finally. "I didn't know what it was for. I swear it, Miss Whitmore. He said it was a message delivery. I didn't ask more than that." $10 was more than a week's wages for a driver. Eleanor filed the number away. "Drive straight through," she said. "No more stops." "Yes, ma'am." Her heart was beating harder now. Not from fear exactly. From the understanding that the window she had thought she was working inside had just become smaller. Beaumont knew she'd gone to Richmond. She arrived back at Whitmore Farm to find Nathaniel's horse already tied at the post. He was inside, standing in the kitchen, with a man she didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to formal settings. Nathaniel turned the moment she opened the door, and the look on his face told her the news had already reached him. "Beaumont filed a complaint this morning," he said. "With Judge Harlan." Eleanor stopped in the doorway. "What kind of complaint?" "Forgery. He's accusing you of falsifying your father's financial records. Specifically, the harvest filings from 1814 and 1815. The room went very quiet. She understood the move immediately. Beaumont had found out they had the county records probably through Harlan himself. And instead of waiting to see what they would do with those records, he had done what powerful men always do. When they're cornered, he had attacked first. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to make her look like the criminal before she could make him look like one. "He's accusing me of forging the records he actually forged," she said. "Yes." "This man is she began. "Marcus Reed," Nathaniel said. "He's an attorney from Charlottesville. I sent for him yesterday when I began to suspect Beaumont was going to move." He looked at her. "Tell me you got what you went to Richmond for." She reached inside her coat and put Webb's statement on the kitchen table. Reed picked it up immediately. He read it standing up, turning pages quickly, with the focused efficiency of a man who knows what he's looking for and is tracking whether he's found it. When he set it down, his expression had changed. "This is Douglas Webb's statement," Eleanor said. "Signed. Witnessed by the innkeeper in Richmond, who I asked specifically for that purpose." "You had the innkeeper witness it," Reed said. "I didn't know if Webb would still be willing after I left," Eleanor said. "I wanted it witnessed before I walked out the door." Reed looked at Nathaniel. Something passed between them, the specific look of two men acknowledging that they have both underestimated the same person. "With this," Reed said slowly, and the Aldridge records and the Tanner testimony and the Perkins statement. Miss Whitmore, what you have here is not a defense against Beaumont's forgery accusation. It's a counter-prosecution. I know what it is, she said. How quickly can we file? Not with Harlan, Nathaniel said immediately. Harlan will bury it. Then above Harlan, Eleanor said. You said this rises to the state level. Then let it rise. The State Circuit Court, Reed said. I have a contact in the Attorney General's office, a man named Price who has been looking for a substantial case to make his name on. If I show him this. He tapped the web statement. This is the kind of thing that makes careers. He'll move quickly. Then you leave tomorrow, Nathaniel said. Tonight, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. Beaumont filed the complaint this morning, she said. He knows we went to Richmond. He may already know about Webb. If Price doesn't have this material in his hands before Beaumont has a chance to get to anyone else, we lose the window. She looked at Reed. Can you travel tonight? Reed looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Eleanor. He picked up his hat. I'll need a fresh horse, he said. Nathaniel was already moving toward the door. You'll have one. Tugd. Reed left within the hour. Nathaniel stayed. The farm was quiet in the way that things are quiet when something significant has just happened, and the people involved haven't yet found the right words for it. Eleanor made coffee because her hands needed something to do, and Nathaniel stood near the window and watched the road, and neither of them said anything for a while. He's going to push the court case here, Nathaniel said finally. The forgery complaint. Harlan will schedule a hearing, probably within 2 weeks, given that Beaumont will want to move while the accusation is fresh and before we can establish a counter record. I know. You'll have to appear. I know that too. Eleanor. He said her name the same way he'd said it in his study, not formally, not by accident, but with a specific weight that told her he'd made a decision about it. If Harlan's hearing comes before Price can act at the state level, you will be standing in front of a judge who is complicit in the scheme you're trying to expose. Beaumont will have his attorney, his witnesses, his 30 years of social standing. And you will have the truth, she said. She turned around and looked at him. Which is not always enough, I understand that. But it's what I have. He crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her, which was closer than he usually stood, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in temperature, not dramatically, just with a new and specific awareness. I'm going to be there, he said. At the hearing. Whatever Harlan has planned, I'm going to be in that room. You can't do anything about Harlan's decisions. No. But Beaumont needs to see that this is not just a woman with some account books. His voice was level, quiet. He needs to understand that whoever he's fighting both of us. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She had been alone in this for so long that the offer of someone standing beside her felt strange in a way she didn't have clean language for. Not weakness, she didn't need him. She had built every piece of this herself. But there was a difference between not needing someone and not wanting them there, and she was beginning to be honest enough with herself to know which side of that line she was on. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood there for a moment, the coffee getting cold on the counter, the summer evening pressing in at the windows. Then, Beaumont's second move arrived. A knock at the door, not tentative, the knock of someone who does not expect to be turned away. Eleanor opened it. 2 men on the step. One she'd seen before, one of Beaumont's regular hands, a man who often ran errands for him around the county. The other was a stranger with a legal satchel, and the specific expression of a man who has delivered bad news before and has learned not to be affected by the reaction. The man with the satchel held out a document. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, he said. Yes. You are hereby notified that a hearing before the Albemarle County Court regarding the matter of Whitmore Estate financial records has been scheduled for 1 week from this Friday. Attendance is required. 1 week. She took the document. She read it. She kept her face calm. Thank you, she said, and closed the door. She turned around. Nathaniel had heard. He was already reading over her shoulder. 1 week was not enough time. Price needed at least 2 weeks to review the materials, arrange for an emergency motion at the state circuit court, and get the paperwork in front of a judge senior enough to intercede in a county hearing. Reed had told her 2 to 3 weeks before he left. 1 week was cutting that in half. "He knows," she said. "He moved the timeline up deliberately," Nathaniel said. "He wants you in that courtroom before we can stop it. Then we have to work faster." She set the summons on the table and picked up her pen. "Write to Reed tonight. Tell him we have 7 days and not one more. Tell him whatever Price needs to make this move, we will provide it, more statements, more documentation, whatever he asks for." She was already writing. "And I need to talk to Aldridge again, before the hearing. If he's willing to testify about those amendment records in an Albemarle courtroom, Aldridge will be in Harlan's court," Nathaniel said quietly, "testifying against an amendment that Harlan himself authorized." "I know." She didn't stop writing. "But Aldridge moved the original filings to a separate location. He's been holding on to them for a reason. He wasn't protecting himself. He was waiting for the right moment." She looked up. "I think this is the moment I go back and tell him it's time." Nathaniel watched her. "You're not afraid," he said. Not a question. More like something he was saying out loud because he needed to hear it in the air. "I'm afraid," Eleanor said. "I've been afraid since the day I found that first discrepancy in the east pasture and understood what it meant." She went back to writing. "But being afraid and stopping are not the same thing. They never have been for me." He was quiet for a long time. "I'll write to Reed," he said. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight?" he agreed. She kept writing. He moved to the other end of the table and pulled paper toward him and started composing his own letter. The two of them working in silence side by side at the same table where 3 weeks ago she had been entirely alone. Outside, the summer dark settled over Whitmore Farm. The road was empty. The fields were still. But Albemarle County was shifting underneath all of it. Slow and inevitable, the way the ground shifts before something breaks open. And Eleanor Whitmore, with ink on her fingers and 7 days left on the clock, was writing as fast as she could. Reed's reply arrived on the 3rd day. Eleanor had slept 4 hours in the last 2 nights. She knew this not because she had counted, but because she had finished 3 separate tasks she had planned to spread across a week, and the only time she worked that fast was when her body had decided that rest was a secondary concern. She read the letter at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold beside her. Price had the materials. Price had read Webb's statement in one sitting and immediately requested a meeting with 2 senior members of the state circuit court. The meeting was scheduled. The problem was the date, 9 days from now, 2 days after the Albemarle hearing. She set the letter down. Nathaniel was beside her. He had been coming to the farm every morning since the summons arrived, arriving before she'd finished her first cup of coffee and staying until the light was gone and she had stopped pretending she didn't find it steadying. "He can't move before the hearing," she said. "No. Which means we walk into Harlan's courtroom with everything we've built and no state-level protection yet." "Yes." She picked up the letter again. Read it again as if the date might have changed. It hadn't. "Then we change what we do in that courtroom," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Beaumont filed forgery charges to put me on the defensive. He expects me to walk in there and try to prove I didn't falsify records." She set the letter down flat on the table. "But we don't defend. We present. We put everything we have in front of that court. The Aldridge records, the Perkins statement, the Tanner letter, the Webb statement. And we make the case against Beaumont inside the hearing Beaumont called." She looked at Nathaniel steadily. "He wanted me in that room. I'm going to make sure he regrets that. Harlan will shut it down," Nathaniel said. "The moment you start presenting counter-evidence, Harlan will find a procedural reason to let him try." Her voice was quiet, not calm exactly. The particular stillness of someone who has moved past the point where fear is useful. "If Harlan shuts down legitimate evidence in a public hearing, that's its own record. That's something Price can use at the state level. We don't need to win in Harlan's courtroom, Nathaniel. We need to make it impossible to pretend the hearing was fair." He was silent for a moment. "You're going to force them to show their hand," he said. "They already showed it when they moved the hearing up," she said. "I'm going to make sure everyone in that room understands what they're looking at." She went to see Aldridge the next morning. He was alone in his office when she arrived, which she had timed deliberately. She closed the door behind her and sat down and looked at him and said without preamble, "I need you at the hearing Friday after next." Aldridge set down his pen. He looked at the closed door. He looked at his hands. He did all the things a man does when the thing he has been half expecting finally arrives, and he isn't sure he's as ready as he thought he was. "That's Harlan's courtroom," he said. "I know. Harlan signed those amendment authorizations. I know that too. If I walk into that room and testify about those records—" He stopped. "Miss Whitmore Harlan will find a way to remove me from this position within a month, and Beaumont will make sure I don't find another one in this state." "Yes," she said, "that's likely true." He stared at her. "And you're still asking me?" "I'm asking you because you moved those original filings to a separate location," she said. "You didn't throw them away. You didn't pretend they didn't exist. You kept them, Mr. Aldridge. 3 years you kept them." She leaned forward slightly. "You've been waiting for someone to come through that door and give you a reason to do what you already knew was right. I'm here. I'm asking." The silence between them was long and genuine. Not the silence of a man looking for an exit. The silence of a man making a real decision. "My children are young," he said. "I know. If this doesn't succeed, if Harlan manages to bury it, if Beaumont comes through this untouched, Marcus Reed is in Charlottesville right now with a state attorney general contact named Price, who has read every piece of evidence we have and scheduled a state circuit court meeting for the week after the hearing." She held his gaze. "This will not be buried. The only question is how much of a foundation we build in that courtroom before the state moves. And you, with the original filings, are a cornerstone." Aldridge looked at his desk. He looked at the drawer where Eleanor knew he kept the files. "I'll be there," he said. She stood up. She put out her hand. He shook at the handshake of two people who have just agreed to something serious and want to mark the weight of it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me if we're still standing when it's over." The days before the hearing moved like a river running toward a drop, the current steady, but with a pull underneath it that told you the edge was close. Nathaniel arranged for James Tanner to come up from Kentucky. It took 4 days of correspondence and one very direct letter from Nathaniel himself explaining exactly what was at stake. But Tanner agreed. He arrived 2 days before the hearing. A broad, quiet man in his 50s who had the specific bearing of someone who had spent years being ashamed of something and had finally decided to stop. He sat with Eleanor for 3 hours, the evening before the hearing, going through his account, making sure every detail was consistent with his written statement, answering her questions with the patience and precision of a man who understood that getting this right mattered. At the end of the 3 hours, he looked at her across the table and said, "You remind me of my daughter." "How so?" Eleanor said. "She doesn't stop either," he said, "even when stopping would be easier." Eleanor looked at him. "Stopping was never going to bring my father back," she said, "or your farm, or the other families." She closed her notebook. "But maybe it can make sure it doesn't happen to the next one." Tanner nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to.
Jamal.
The morning of the hearing, Eleanor was up before dawn. She dressed carefully the same way she'd dressed to see Aldridge, not her best, not her worst. The middle dress that said competent and serious, and not the least bit frightened, even if the woman wearing it was all three things simultaneously. Nathaniel arrived at the farm while it was still dark. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She was standing at the table, with her documents organized in a leather satchel she had borrowed from the barn, going through them one more time, checking the order again. "Eleanor," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask." She looked up. He was dressed formally, the kind of formal that said, "This matters," not the kind that said, "I'm trying to impress anyone." His hat was in his hands. "Reed sent a message late last night," he said. "Price has moved the state circuit meeting up. It's now the day after the hearing, not the week after." Something unknotted slightly in her chest. He moved it up. He read the web statement a second time and wrote to Reed that he believes there are grounds for an emergency injunction if the county hearing results in any ruling against you. Nathaniel came fully into the kitchen. "Which means, if Harlan tries to rule against you today, he may find himself facing a state-level reversal within 24 hours. Does Beaumont know?" "I don't see how he could." She looked at him. "Good." She went back to checking her satchel. "You're not going to say it, are you?" Nathaniel said. "Say what?" "That this changes things. That you feel better. That you're—" "I feel exactly the same as I did 10 minutes ago," she said. "The state circuit meeting is good news. It doesn't change what I have to do in the next 4 hours." She closed the satchel. "I still have to walk into Harlan's courtroom and present every piece of this in front of a judge who already knows what we have and has reason to want it buried. The state protection is real, but it's a net below the rope. I still have to walk the rope." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I know." "Then let's go," she said. The Albemarle County Courthouse was already half full when they arrived. Eleanor had not expected that. She had known people would attend county hearings with prominent names attached, always drew an audience. But the number of people already seated when she walked through the doors stopped her for just a fraction of a second. Faces she recognized. Faces she didn't. Neighbors. Merchants. 2 women from the church her father had attended. Several men who worked for landowners in the area sitting together near the back. She walked straight down the center aisle to the front table on the left side. She set her satchel on it. She sat down. Nathaniel took a seat in the front row of the gallery directly behind her. She felt him there the way you feel a solid wall at your back, not because you intend to lean on it, but because knowing it's there changes how you stand. Beaumont arrived 4 minutes later with 2 attorneys and 3 men she didn't recognize, who had the look of professional witnesses, men hired to testify in a specific direction and well practiced at it. He looked at Eleanor when he entered. She looked back at him. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who believes he has already won. She turned back to her satchel and continued organizing her papers. Judge Harlan entered from the side door. 60 years old, gray, with the self-satisfied bearing of a man who has never had serious reason to doubt his own authority. He settled himself at the bench. He looked at Beaumont's side of the room. He looked at Eleanor's side. His eyes lingered on her for a moment. She had seen that look before, men trying to figure out whether she was more or less than they expected. She gave him nothing back. Just looked at him steadily until he looked away. "We're here on the matter of a complaint filed by Charles Beaumont regarding the financial records of the late Thomas Whitmore," Harlan said. "Mr. Beaumont alleges that documents submitted to this court in connection with the Whitmore estate contain falsifications. Miss Whitmore, you are the respondent. Do you have representation?" "I represent myself," Eleanor said. A murmur in the gallery. Harlan's eyebrows went up. "Miss Whitmore, I strongly advise. I am capable of presenting my own case, Your Honor." Her voice was clear and even. "I have organized documents and witnesses, and I am prepared to proceed." Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then, "Very well. Mr. Beaumont, you may present your complaint." Beaumont's attorney, a thin man named Garrett, who spoke with the polished smoothness of someone who had spent years making dishonest things sound reasonable, stood and presented Beaumont's case. It was, Eleanor noted, well constructed. It pointed to 2 specific harvest filings from the Whitmore estate that differed from the official county records. It suggested that Eleanor, as the person managing the estate accounts after her father's decline, had access to and motive to alter those records to create a false narrative of financial fraud in order to avoid repaying a legitimate debt. He named Nathaniel Carter. He suggested Carter was a co-conspirator, motivated by his own financial interest in recovering a bad loan. She heard Nathaniel shift behind her. She did not turn around. When Garrett sat down, Harlan looked at Eleanor. "Miss Whitmore, you may respond." She stood. She picked up the first document in her stack. She did not rush. She had learned watching men present arguments over the years that the ones who rushed were the ones who weren't sure their material was strong enough to carry itself. Her material was strong enough. "Your Honor," she said, "the complaint before this court accuses me of falsifying harvest records. I am going to show this court that the records I possess are not falsified, they are original, and that the records in the official county archive are the ones that were altered." She paused. "I will also show this court who altered them, when, by whose authorization, and why." The gallery was very quiet. Beaumont leaned over to say something to Garrett. Garrett's response was minimal. He was watching her with the specific attention of someone who has just heard something they didn't prepare for. Eleanor placed the Aldridge records on the table. "These are copies of 2 amendment filings from the Albemarle County Archive," she said. "They were obtained from County Clerk Thomas Aldridge. The amendments were submitted to the official record 3 weeks after my father's original filings, changing the harvest yield figures from what my father accurately reported to significantly lower numbers." She looked up at Harlan. "Your Honor, the authorization signature on both amendments is yours." The sound in the courtroom changed. Harlan's face changed. "Miss Whitmore," he began, "I am not accusing you of initiating these amendments," she said, her voice entirely steady. "I am presenting the record as it exists. Both amendments bear your name on the authorization line. I am asking this court to examine that record." She set the copies on the table and picked up the next document. "What I will additionally present is a signed witnessed statement from Thomas Aldridge himself, who will testify today that he identified these amendments as anomalous, preserved the originals separately, and can verify the chain of custody of both documents." Garrett was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is entirely outside the scope." "The scope of this hearing," Eleanor said, raising her voice just slightly, "just enough, is the authenticity of financial records connected to the Whitmore estate. The documents I am presenting go directly to that question." She looked at Harlan. Harlan looked back at her. In his face, she could see the calculation happening in real time. He could shut this down. He had the authority. But shutting it down in a room full of witnesses who had just heard her say the authorization signature that was its own kind of evidence. Every person in that gallery would walk out, knowing he had stopped her from presenting records that bore his name. He knew it. She knew he knew it. And he knew she knew. "Continue," he said. His voice was flat. She placed the Perkins statement. She placed the Tanner letter. She read the relevant sections of the Webb statement aloud, including the specific description of how Webb had recorded numbers Beaumont gave him rather than the counts he had observed, and the dates on which this had occurred. With each document, the courtroom grew quieter. Then she said, "I'd like to call Thomas Aldridge." Aldridge came forward from the back of the room. He sat in the witness seat. He folded his hands. He looked at Harlan with the expression of a man who has made his peace with the consequences of what he is about to say. "Mr. Aldridge," Eleanor said, "you are the Albemarle County Clerk." "I am." "And in your capacity as county clerk, you are responsible for the official archive of county records." "I am." "Did you at some point identify an anomaly in the harvest filings submitted by Thomas Whitmore for the years 1814 and 1815? "I did." "What was the nature of that anomaly?" "2 amendment filings were submitted to those records after the fact," Aldridge said. "The original filings remained consistent with other documentation I had in the archive. The amendment filings changed the yield numbers significantly downward. When I compared them to purchase records from the same period the amendments did not track." He paused. "I preserved the original filings separately at that time. Can you confirm for the court that the documents I presented as the amendment filings are accurate copies of what exists in your archive?" "I can confirm that." "And can you confirm that the authorization signature on those amendments belongs to Judge Harlan?" A breath held across the entire room. "I can confirm that the signature on both documents reads as Judge Harlan's name," Aldridge said carefully. I am not a handwriting expert. I can confirm only what the document contains. It was exactly the right answer. Not more than he could honestly say. Enough to establish the fact. Garrett objected 3 times during Aldridge's testimony. Harlan sustained 1 and overruled 2, and Eleanor watched his face on each decision and saw what he was doing. He was trying to appear impartial. He was trying to create a record that didn't look like suppression. Because somewhere in the last 20 minutes, she realized Harlan had understood that his best outcome in this room was no longer victory for Beaumont. It was distance. He was trying to separate himself from what was coming. James Tanner testified next. He was not a polished speaker. He was a farmer from Kentucky who had lost something he should never have lost. And when he sat in that witness chair and told the room what had happened to his land, the outside observer, the recorded shortfalls, the impossible debt, the purchase offer that had felt like rescue. His voice caught twice, and he did not apologize for it. When he was done, the room was so still, Eleanor could hear someone breathing unevenly in the back row. Beaumont's attorneys did not cross-examine him aggressively. Eleanor suspected they had been told at some point during the last hour not to push too hard, not to give the witnesses more space to talk. Beaumont himself had gone very still. She had been watching him from the corner of her eye, throughout the way you watch a fire. You're managing, not directly, not obsessively, but with the awareness that it can change direction faster than you expect. He had arrived in that room supremely confident. He had watched the first 20 minutes of her presentation with barely concealed contempt. But somewhere around the Webb statement, somewhere around the moment she read aloud that Webb had been paid through a firm in which Beaumont held a silent 40% stake, the contempt had shifted into something else. Not fear. Men like Beaumont didn't show fear, especially not in public. But recalculation. The specific stillness of a man who has realized that the situation is not what he thought it was, and is trying to determine his next move without anyone seeing him do it. She kept her face neutral and turned back to the court. Harlan called a brief recess an hour and 40 minutes into the hearing. Eleanor stood in the corridor outside with Nathaniel, and he put his hand on her arm just briefly, just for a moment, and she felt the weight of it. The way you feel someone hand you something solid when your arms have been shaking for a long time without you realizing it. "You're doing it," he said. "We're not done," she said. "I know, but you're doing it." He paused. "Aldridge just told me Harlan sent his clerk out during the recess. He's trying to reach someone." "Price?" she said immediately. "Possibly. Or someone who can tell him how exposed he is at the state level." Nathaniel's voice was low and even. "He's starting to understand that the state circuit has this material. He's trying to figure out how far it's gone." "Good," Eleanor said. "Let him." She went back in when the recess ended. It was Beaumont himself who broke. She hadn't expected that. She had expected Garrett to pivot to try a different legal strategy to file some procedural motion. She had not expected Beaumont to stand up. But he stood up. He stood up, and he looked at Harlan, and he said in a voice that had lost most of its polish, "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief adjournment to review some of the documentation that has been presented this morning." Harlan looked at him. Something passed between them. The complicated look of 2 men who have been useful to each other for a long time and are trying to determine whether they still can be. "Granted," Harlan said. "This hearing is adjourned until Monday morning." A ripple through the gallery. Eleanor gathered her papers. She did not rush. She did not show what she was feeling. But her hands moving through the familiar stack of documents she had built page by page alone in a back barn over 3 years were finally completely steady. Nathaniel was beside her as she stood. "Monday," she said quietly. "Monday." He agreed. "Which means tomorrow Reed goes to Price, and Price files the injunction before Beaumont can do anything with the weekend." She looked at him. "You already planned for this." "I planned for the possibility," he said. "Reed has been waiting for my signal since this morning." She held his gaze. "Send it." He nodded. He turned. "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped, looked back. She had things she wanted to say. Things that had been building for weeks through shared work tables and coffee gone cold, and letters written side by side in the dark, and the particular weight of someone who kept showing up. Things she did not yet know how to say cleanly, without her voice doing something she wasn't ready for it to do. "Thank you," she said, "for today." He looked at her for a long moment. "You did not need me in there," he said. "No," she said honestly, "but I was glad you were there." Something in his face changed, not dramatically. The same almost smile she'd first seen in the barn, but fuller now, less guarded, like something that had been held back for a long time and was finally tired of the effort. "Go home," he said. "Sleep. I'll send word when it's done." She picked up her satchel. She walked out of the Albemarle County Courthouse into the summer afternoon with her papers and her evidence and the specific exhaustion of someone who has done a hard thing and hasn't yet let herself feel how hard it was. But underneath the exhaustion, steady and real and quietly burning, was something she recognized. Not relief. Not yet. Certainty. She had walked into that courtroom today, and she had not asked to be believed. She had not asked for mercy or for grace, or for the kind of consideration people extend to women they feel sorry for. She had presented the truth document by document, witness by witness, with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years making sure it was irrefutable. And the most powerful man in Albemarle County was sitting in a room right now recalculating. She walked to the carriage. She got in. She looked out the window at the courthouse as the horses started moving. Charles Beaumont had called that hearing to bury her. Instead, she had made him afraid. Reed's message arrived before dawn on Saturday. Eleanor heard the rider from inside the farmhouse and was at the door before he'd fully stopped. She took the letter from his hand, read it standing on the step in the gray early light, and stood very still for a moment after she finished. Price had filed the injunction. The State Circuit Court had reviewed the materials, Webb's statement, the Aldridge records, the Tanner testimony, the Perkins account, and a senior circuit judge named Holloway had signed an emergency order late Friday evening. The order did 3 things. It stayed any ruling from the Albemarle County hearing pending state-level review. It opened a formal state investigation into Charles Beaumont on charges of systematic financial fraud, conspiracy to corrupt official records, and abuse of county authority. And it placed Judge Harlan on administrative suspension pending inquiry into the amendment authorizations bearing his signature. She read that last part twice. Harlan was suspended. She went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put the letter flat on the wood in front of her and pressed both palms on top of it and breathed. 3 years. 3 years of counting alone in a back barn while everyone around her had seen a grieving daughter barely keeping her father's failed farm together. 3 years of writing in margins and cross-referencing seed receipts and memorizing numbers that didn't add up, and understanding with absolute lonely clarity exactly what they meant and exactly what would happen if she couldn't prove it. And now Judge Holloway's signature on a piece of paper in her hands. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry until it was fully over, and it was not fully over yet. But she sat there for a long time with her hands on that letter and let herself feel the weight of what she was holding. Then she got up, made coffee, and started planning what came next. Nathaniel arrived 2 hours later, and she could tell from the way he came through the door that he already knew. "Reed sent me a copy," he said. "I figured." He looked at her. She looked at him. There was something in the air between them that neither of them had made direct, yet something that had been building through weeks of shared tables and early mornings and letters written side by side in the dark, and that had come very close to the surface in the courthouse corridor, when she had said she was glad he was there and his face had done the thing she was still thinking about. They were both, she reflected, very practiced at staying on the task directly in front of them. "Beaumont's attorneys filed a response to the injunction last night," Nathaniel said, pulling a second letter from his coat. "They're arguing procedural grounds, that the state court acted outside its jurisdiction in staying a county hearing." They can argue it, Eleanor said. Holloway already signed. The stay is in place. Yes, but Beaumont's going to push back hard. He has money and he has lawyers, and he has 30 years of favors owed to him across this state. He sat down across from her. This isn't over because Holloway signed a piece of paper. I know that, she said. What's Beaumont's next move? Character, Nathaniel said. He can't fight the documents anymore. There are too many of them from too many independent sources. So he'll fight you. He'll go after your credibility, your character, your mental state since your father died. He'll suggest the documents were obtained improperly. He'll find someone credible to testify that you're a grieving woman who has constructed a conspiracy where none exists. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He needs that someone fast, she said, before the state investigation formally opens. He's been making visits, Nathaniel said. Reed's man in Charlottesville tracked 3 separate calls Beaumont made yesterday afternoon, 2 to county merchants, 1 to Reverend Marsh. She looked up. Reverend Marsh. He buried your father, Nathaniel said. He also counseled my father during the last year. He knew how troubled my father was near the end. She set the cup down. If Beaumont gets Marsh to testify that Thomas Whitmore was erratic, that his records and accounts were in disarray, that his daughter was managing a declining man's affairs in a state of grief that plants a seed, even with everything we have. That's what I'm afraid of, Nathaniel said. Then I need to speak to Marsh before Beaumont does. Nathaniel looked at her. He may already have. Then I need to speak to him anyway. She stood. Is he at the church this morning? Saturday morning he'll be there until noon. She picked up her coat. Eleanor. Nathaniel's voice stopped her. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had first read as calculation and now understood was something more careful than that. Something he didn't put on public display the same way he didn't put most of what he actually thought on public display. Let me come with you. I know you don't need me, he said. I'm not offering because I think you can't do it alone. I'm offering because Marsh is an old man who spent 40 years in this county being told that Charles Beaumont was an upstanding pillar of the community. He's going to find it easier to question that story if someone besides you is sitting across from him. A pause. Let me be useful. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Come on then. Reverend Marsh was a small, white-haired man with the permanently sad eyes of someone who had sat with too many people at the worst moments of their lives and absorbed some of the weight of each one. He received them in the small parlor behind the sanctuary, and when he saw Nathaniel Carter beside Eleanor Whitmore, he folded his hands in his lap with the careful stillness of a man who understands that the visit is more serious than a social call. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Carter. Reverend, Eleanor said. Has Mr. Beaumont spoken to you in the last 2 days? No preamble, no gentle approach. She had decided in the carriage that she didn't have time for it, and that Marsh was a man who would respect directness more than he would respect an elaborate softening of the real question. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He paid a call yesterday afternoon, he said. What did he ask of you? Marsh looked at his hands. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathaniel. He asked me to write a letter, he said, attesting to Thomas Whitmore's mental and emotional state in the last year of his life. He suggested such a letter might be relevant to a legal proceeding regarding the estate accounts. Did you write it? Eleanor asked. I have not yet, Marsh said. He held her gaze. But I want to be honest with you, Miss Whitmore. What he described the proceeding, the accusations, he framed it as a protection of your father's memory. He suggested that persons were misrepresenting your father's state of mind and affairs in order to pursue a financial claim. He told you we were the ones misrepresenting things, Eleanor said. Yes, Reverend Marsh. She reached into her coat and produced 2 documents, the Webb statement and the Tanner letter. She set them on the table between them. My father was not erratic. My father was defrauded. These are signed witnessed statements from 2 separate individuals describing the same scheme operating on their properties. The same outside observer, the same method, the same result. She touched the top page. My father trusted a man who was stealing from him before the ink on the first loan document was dry. And the shame of being fooled, that's what broke him. Not confusion, not deteriorating judgment. Shame. Marsh looked at the documents. He did not pick them up immediately. I believe you, he said quietly. Eleanor stopped. I want to be clear, Marsh continued. I did not intend to write that letter. When Mr. Beaumont left, I sat here for an hour thinking about your father, about the conversations we had, about what he told me in confidence in this room. He looked at her directly. Thomas Whitmore was not a confused man. He was a man who knew exactly what had happened to him and could not forgive himself for allowing it. Those are entirely different things. The room was very still. Would you be willing to say that? Eleanor asked. Not as an attack on Beaumont, just as the truth about my father. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, I would. Thank you, she said. She meant it the way she'd meant it with Aldridge, the weight of it, not just the words. By Monday morning, Beaumont's legal team had filed 2 more responses to the state injunction and retained a 4th attorney. The speed of it, Reed told Eleanor by letter, was itself revealing. Innocent men did not move like that. Eleanor read that line and thought, no, they don't. The state investigation formally opened on Monday at the Circuit Court in Charlottesville, and Price, the Attorney General's contact, who had moved this entire thing forward in the space of a week, sent word through Reed that he intended to call Eleanor as a witness in the first session. She dressed in her best dress. Nathaniel rode with her to Charlottesville. 3 hours in the carriage. They talked most of it not about the case which they had covered thoroughly, but about other things. About the land. About the years after his father had died, and he'd taken over an estate he hadn't been prepared for, and had spent 2 years being privately terrified while appearing publicly certain. About the way her father used to wake early and walk the east pasture every morning, not because he needed to check on anything, but because he loved the way it looked at first light. She hadn't talked about her father that way to anyone since he died. She hadn't realized she was waiting to. When they arrived, she was steadier than she had been on the morning of the county hearing. She knew why. It wasn't the state venue or Price's competence or the fact that they now had the circuit court on their side. It was that she had spent 3 hours in a carriage being treated like someone whose thoughts were worth hearing, and that was not nothing. After 3 years of working alone, that was a significant thing. The state hearing was methodical in the way that serious legal proceedings are methodical. No drama, no gallery. Just Price and his team, a court recorder, the circuit judge, and Eleanor seated at a table with her documents. She testified for 2 hours. Price was skilled. He walked her through the timeline in sequence, asking questions that let her own words build the picture, not interrupting, not leading, just clearing the path so the story could come out straight. She presented the documents as she had in Harlan's courtroom, but here there was no Beaumont seated at the opposite table, no Garrett objecting on procedural grounds, no audience watching to see if she'd break. Just the truth moving through a room where people were there to hear it. When she finished, Judge Holloway, who had been present through all of it, asked her one question. Miss Whitmore, how long did you work on assembling this evidence before you approached anyone else? 3 years, she said, and approximately 2 months alone before Mr. Carter and I began working together. Holloway nodded. He made a note. He did not say anything more. But Price, gathering his papers at the end of the session, looked at her and said quietly, You built a better case than most attorneys I know. I had more at stake, she said. He smiled. That tends to help. Matid. The state investigation moved quickly after that, quicker than Eleanor had dared to expect. Within the first week, Price's team had subpoenaed the land acquisition firm's records and found transactions connecting Beaumont's 40% stake to payments made in the same months as the harvest shortfalls on 3 separate properties, including Whitmore Farm and Carter's eastern parcels. Within the second week, Douglas Webb gave his full statement directly to the state court, longer and more detailed than what he'd written for Eleanor in Richmond, because this time he had Price sitting across from him, explaining exactly what cooperation would mean for his own situation. Webb named 2 other men Beaumont had used in the scheme. Both were located. One talked immediately. The other took 3 days. By the end of the 3rd week, the picture was complete. 5 farms over 6 years. A systematic method: place an observer, corrupt the count, alter the official record, through Harlan's authorization, let the debt become impossible, move in with a purchase offer. The land acquisition firm had sold 3 of the 5 properties at substantial profit within 2 years of acquisition. The other 2, including Whitmore Farm, which Beaumont had not yet managed to acquire, were intended for the same fate. Harlan's role had been, in the end, what Eleanor had suspected, not the architect, but the facilitator. He had signed amendment authorizations Beaumont had presented to him with explanations that were either fabricated or misleading. Price was still determining how much Harlan had understood. Whether he faced criminal charges or merely the end of his career depended on that determination. Eleanor found she could not spend much energy thinking about Harlan. He was not the one who had taken her father's pride and his sleep and the last good years of his life. That was Beaumont. Beaumont was arrested on a Tuesday. Eleanor heard about it from Nathaniel, who rode to the farm with the news before she'd had her second cup of coffee. He came in through the kitchen door without knocking. He had stopped knocking sometime in the last 2 weeks, and she had stopped noticing that he'd stopped, and she looked up from her table and read the answer in his face before he said a word. "This morning," he said. "Price filed the formal charges last night. They arrested him at his estate." She set down her cup very carefully. "How many charges?" she said. 11, he said. "Fraud, conspiracy, corruption of official records. 3 counts related to the acquisition firm specifically." He paused. "And 1 charge they added yesterday, perjury based on a sworn statement Beaumont made to Harlan in 1815, claiming the amendments were authorized by the original filers. 12 charges total in the end." She sat for a moment. "My father," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He died thinking he had failed. He died thinking the farm was going to be taken because he had been a poor manager and a foolish borrower and had let his family down." She looked at the table. "He never knew it wasn't his fault." Nathaniel sat down across from her. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her that her father was at peace, or that he could see from wherever he was now that the truth had come out. He just sat there, which was the right thing. It was what she would have wanted, and she understood in that moment that he had learned that about her not by being told, but by paying attention. After a while she said, "The debt." "Cancelled," Nathaniel said. "Formally in writing. I drew up the documents last week. I was waiting for the arrest before I brought them." He set a folded paper on the table between them. "Whitmore Farm is yours. Free and clear. No conditions." She looked at the paper. She did not reach for it immediately. "That's not the same as forgiveness," she said. "You're owed that money." "I'm owed money that was only needed because a man was stealing from your family," he said. "I'll pursue what I'm owed through the state proceedings against Beaumont. That's where the debt belongs." He held her gaze. "The farm is yours." She picked up the paper. She read it. She set it down. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "You earned it." She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window. Somewhere outside, one of the field hands was starting his morning rounds. The farm was making its ordinary sounds that had for the last 3 years been underscored by a low, constant dread that she had gotten so used to she'd almost stopped hearing it. The dread was gone. She noticed its absence, the way you notice the absence of a sound you've lived with for so long you forgot it was there. "There's something I want to ask you," Nathaniel said. His voice had shifted not much, just enough for her to register the change. The controlled professional precision that was his default was slightly different. slightly more careful in the way that something is careful when it actually matters. She looked at him. "I want to ask it correctly," he said, "which means I need you to let me finish before you decide how to answer." "All right," she said. "I have spent 6 weeks working beside you," he said. "And in those 6 weeks I have watched you build a legal case from nothing. Persuade 4 separate witnesses to step into situations that frightened them out. Maneuver a man with 30 years and unlimited resources, and walk into 2 courtrooms and present evidence with a steadiness that most trained attorneys don't manage." He paused. "I have also watched you make coffee when you were exhausted, and argue with me when you thought I was wrong, and talk about your father in a way that made me understand exactly what you were fighting for." Eleanor did not move. "I'm not asking because you need help," he said. "And I'm not asking because the farm is saved, and it seems like the right time. I'm asking because I have been in rooms with a great many people over the course of my life, and I have very rarely been in a room where the person I was talking to made me think harder and feel more careful and want to do better." He met her eyes directly. "I would like to keep being in rooms with you, Eleanor, for a long time, under different circumstances than debt collection and fraud investigations."
Bowetti. The
kitchen was completely quiet. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly. She was a woman who looked at all the numbers first, who cross-referenced and verified, and made sure she understood what she was actually looking at before she committed to an interpretation. That was how she was built. That was how she had survived. But she had also learned over 3 years of being entirely alone in a back barn that some things didn't need more time. Some things you already knew. You had known them for a while, and you had simply been too focused on the work to let yourself say so. "You stopped knocking," she said. He blinked. "What?" "When you come to the farm. You stopped knocking on the kitchen door sometime in the last 2 weeks." She held his gaze. "I noticed. I didn't say anything." She paused. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to start again." He went very still. "That's not a no," he said. "No," she said. "It is not a no." Something in his face shifted the controlled, careful surface of him, softening in a way she had seen only in glimpses before, the almost smile becoming the actual thing, full and unguarded, and entirely different from anything he showed the rest of the world. She thought about her father, who had loved this land and trusted the wrong person, and died not knowing his daughter had fixed it. She thought about 3 years in a barn with a lantern and a stack of ledgers, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes not from having no one around, but from having no one who could see what you were actually doing. She thought about Roy Perkins and his 8 pages of handwriting, and James Tanner coming up from Kentucky because someone had finally asked, and Thomas Aldridge, who had kept those files in a separate drawer for 3 years, waiting for a reason. And she thought about Nathaniel Carter, who had come to take her farm, and instead had sat down across from her and read her numbers. "There are things we should discuss," she said. "Practical things. The farm, the estate, what the state proceedings mean for the next year. None of it is simple." "No," he agreed. "And I'm not going to be the kind of woman who disappears into someone else's life," she said. "I want that to be clear. This farm is mine. I intend to run it. I would expect nothing else," he said. "I would be disappointed by anything else." She looked at him. "Then we'll discuss the practical things," she said. "Yes. Starting tomorrow." "That seems right," he said. She picked up her coffee cup. He picked up his. They sat at the table in the morning light, and it was very ordinary and very easy, and felt to Eleanor like something she had not had in a very long time. The state proceedings against Charles Beaumont lasted 4 months. He was convicted on 9 of the 11 charges. The jury deliberated for 2 days and came back with the kind of verdict that is not a close call. Not a judgment made by people who are uncertain, but one made by people who have looked at the evidence and have nowhere left to stand except the obvious conclusion. He was sentenced to 7 years in a state prison facility. The land acquisition firm was dissolved. The 3 properties that had been acquired through the scheme and not yet resold were returned to their original owners or their heirs, where heirs could be located. James Tanner did not get his Kentucky years back, but he stood on the steps of the Charlottesville courthouse after the verdict was read and shook Eleanor's hand for a long time without speaking. And she understood that too. Judge Harlan resigned before criminal charges were formally filed. He retired to a smaller county in western Virginia and was not heard from publicly again. Thomas Aldridge was appointed acting county judge by the state, pending a formal election, which he won 11 months later by a margin that told everyone in Albemarle County exactly what the community thought had happened and who had been on the right side of it. Douglas Webb received a reduced sentence, 60 days, and a substantial fine in exchange for his full cooperation with state investigators. He did not get married in the fall. He got married the following spring quietly and wrote Eleanor a brief note thanking her for giving him what he called the only way out that left me able to look at myself in the mirror. She kept the note. Roy Perkins stayed on at Carter Farm. Nathaniel gave him a formal contract and a raise and told him plainly that a man who had the courage to tell the truth when it cost him something was worth more than most. Perkins said, "I reckon I should have told somebody sooner." And Nathaniel said, "You told somebody when it mattered." And that was the end of it. Yagged. The following spring, Eleanor Whitmore stood in the east pasture of her farm. Not the back barn, not the work table. The actual field, the one her father had borrowed money to repair, the one that should have lifted them, and instead had been used against them, the one she had counted every harvest of for 3 years while nobody watched. The irrigation was working. The crop was coming in. Not dramatically, not as a symbol, just as a field doing what a well-tended field does when you give it what it needs and leave it alone. She had a letter in her coat pocket from a woman in Richmond. She didn't know the wife of one of the farmers whose property had been caught up in the Beaumont scheme. The woman had written to say thank you and to say that her husband had not slept properly in 3 years and had now slept properly for 2 weeks running, and that she didn't know how to say what that meant, but she was trying anyway. Eleanor had read the letter 3 times. She heard boots behind her and didn't turn around. She knew the step. "Crop looks good," Nathaniel said. "It does," she said. He came to stand beside her. Their arms nearly touched. She let them. "Reed says Price is being considered for State Solicitor General," he said. "Good. He earned it. He says Price asked about you, whether you'd ever considered law." She looked at the field. "I have a farm to run." "I told him that," Nathaniel said. He said the 2 things didn't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive in this state given current discussions about property rights and legal standing. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a larger conversation." "Yes," he said. "I thought so too." She turned and looked at him. Nathaniel Carter. In a field in the early spring morning. Not the man who had ridden up her drive with a document in his hand and the manner of someone who knew the outcome in advance. That man had been real, but this one was more so the one who had sat across a work table from her night after night, who had sent the right letter at the right time, who had stood in a courtroom behind her so she could feel the wall at her back, who had stopped knocking and had never once, not once, told her what she should do or who she should be. "I'd like to have that conversation," she said. "Someday." "Someday soon?" he asked. She almost smiled. "Sooner than later." He nodded once the way he nodded when something was settled, when the handshake was done and the terms were agreed on, and both parties understood what came next. She turned back to the field. The east pasture of Whitmore Farm stretched out in front of her, green and ordinary, and entirely hers, not because someone gave it to her, not because someone saved her, but because she had stood in a back barn alone in the dark for 3 years and counted every number and held every truth and refused through every season of it to let go of what she knew. Eleanor Whitmore had not been rescued. She had done what women like her have always done when the world underestimates them and the walls close in, and there is no one coming. She had counted the numbers, learned the law, found the witnesses, built the case, and walked through the door herself. And on the other side of it, she found not just justice, but the life she had always been capable of living on her own terms, on her own land, standing upright in the morning light, with no debt, no shame, and no one left to answer to but herself.